He had fired people for less, but tonight he decided to humiliate her instead. The entire restaurant went silent as the billionaire looked her in the eyes and said one sentence that shattered her dignity. He thought she was powerless, replaceable, forgettable. But what he didn't know was this waitress had walked into his life for one reason, and before this night was over, she would force him to face a truth he had spent 15 years running from. The first thing people noticed about Adrian Voss wasn't his wealth. It was his silence. He walked into Vespera, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, without looking at anyone, not the hostess, not the guests, not even the manager rushing forward to greet him. His presence didn't demand attention. It simply took it. Conversations softened. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the piano player, who had performed for presidents and royalty, lowered his volume instinctively. Adrian Voss didn't need introductions. At 39 years old, he was the youngest self-made billionaire in the city, founder of Voss Technologies. Net worth, $11.4 billion, known in business media as the architect, because he didn't just build companies, he dismantled competitors. And he never apologized for it. Not once. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly across his shoulders, tailored with mathematical precision. His dark hair was neat, untouched by stress or hesitation. His expression was calm, detached, controlled. Emotion, to Adrian, was inefficiency. And inefficiency was unacceptable. "Mr. Voss," the manager said quickly, appearing beside him with a nervous smile. "Your table is ready." Adrian gave a single nod. Nothing more. He followed without a word, his polished shoes moving across the marble floor with quiet authority. He didn't look at the couples dining. He didn't notice the subtle stares. He didn't care. People were variables. Useful when efficient, removed when not. That was the rule. And Adrian Voss had built an empire by obeying it. Across the room, Elena Carter noticed him immediately. Not because of his face, but because of everyone else's reaction to it. She stood near the service station, holding a silver tray steady in her hands, her posture relaxed but precise. Her dark hair was tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her uniform was simple, black and clean, pressed carefully. She looked like every other waitress. Invisible. Replaceable. Forgettable. But her eyes were different. They didn't stare in admiration like the others. They observed. Calculated. She watched the way the manager leaned slightly forward when speaking to him, the way the hostess straightened her posture as he passed, the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around his existence. Power wasn't loud. It was gravitational. And Adrian Voss had gravity. Elena didn't look away. Not when he sat down. Not when he removed his coat. Not even when, for a brief second, his eyes lifted and met hers. It lasted less than a moment. His gaze moved past her instantly. Dismissed. As if she had never existed. Elena felt it. That quiet erasure. Most people would have looked down. Most people would have felt small. She didn't. Her expression didn't change. But something behind her eyes sharpened. Table 12 is yours, Marcus, the floor manager said as he approached her, his voice low and urgent. Alina didn't need to ask who he meant. She had already memorized the number. She nodded once and picked up a glass of water from the station. Marcus hesitated. Just be careful, he added. He doesn't like mistakes. Alina almost smiled. I don't make mistakes, she said calmly. Marcus didn't know why her answer made him uneasy. He just nodded and stepped away. Adrian didn't look up when she approached. He was reading something on his phone, his expression unchanged. Alina placed the glass gently in front of him. Good evening, she said, her voice calm, steady. Welcome to Vespera. No response. He kept reading. She waited. Not awkwardly. Not nervously. Just waited. Finally, without looking up, he spoke. Sparkling, he said. His voice was smooth, cold, certain. He pushed the still water aside slightly. Alina replaced it immediately. Efficient. Precise. He noticed that. Not consciously. But his brain registered it. No hesitation. No apology. No wasted motion. Interesting. Still, he didn't look at her. Are you ready to order? She asked. He named the dish without hesitation. Of course he already knew. Men like Adrian didn't improvise. They decided. And expected the world to follow. She nodded once. But before she could turn away, he spoke again. Make sure it's done properly. It wasn't a request. It was a warning disguised as instruction. Alina met his eyes. Not challengingly. Not submissively. Simply directly. It will be, she said. For the first time, Adrian looked at her fully. Not as a person. As a variable. Something about her tone was different. No fear. No excessive politeness. Just certainty. It irritated him. He didn't know why. She walked away before he could analyze it further. 15 minutes later, she returned with his plate. Perfect presentation. Perfect timing. Perfect execution. She placed it in front of him smoothly. He examined it. Visually flawless. He cut into it. Tasted it. And paused. The flavor was correct. The temperature was correct. Everything was correct. And yet, something inside him rejected it. Not the food. The moment. He looked up at her. She was standing calmly, hands folded lightly in front of her. Waiting. Not nervously. Just waiting. He didn't like being watched. Especially not like that. Take it back, he said. The words were quiet, but absolute. Alina didn't move. Is something wrong with it? She asked. He placed the fork down carefully. I said, he replied, his voice lowering slightly, take it back. The air around the table shifted. Nearby conversations softened. People sensed tension. Alina remained still. Of course, she said calmly. She reached forward and lifted the plate. Her hands were steady. No shaking. No apology. No visible emotion. Adrian watched her closely now, trying to identify the discomfort forming in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't dissatisfaction. It was something unfamiliar. Lack of control. In the kitchen, Marcus rushed toward her. "What happened?" he whispered urgently. "He wants it remade," Alina replied simply. Marcus looked horrified. "The chef made that personally." Alina didn't respond. She handed him the plate. "Then he'll make it again." Marcus stared at her. "You don't understand," he said. "This is Adrian Voss." Alina met his eyes calmly. "I know exactly who he is." Marcus didn't know why that answer unsettled him more than anything else she could have said. 10 minutes later, she returned. Second plate. Identical. Flawless. She placed it in front of him. Again, he examined it. Again, he tasted it. And again. He put the fork down. This time louder. A faint clink echoed across the table. Alina didn't move. "This is unacceptable," he said. Her expression didn't change. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she replied calmly. The words were polite, but the tone wasn't submissive. It was neutral, objective. It felt like resistance. Adrian leaned back slightly. Now he was looking at her fully, studying her. Most people broke under this moment, apologized excessively, panicked. She didn't. She just stood there, present, unafraid. It triggered something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. "Challen, you're sorry I feel that way," he repeated quietly. She held his gaze. "Yes." The silence between them stretched. Heavy, electric, dangerous. People nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. Adrian spoke again. Slowly, deliberately. "Do you know who I am?" It was the question men, like him, used when reality needed correction. Alina answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation. No curiosity. No awe. Just acknowledgement. It wasn't the answer he expected. It didn't restore control. It made it worse. Because she wasn't impressed. And Adrian Voss had built his entire world on being unimpressive to no one. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "Colder. Then you should understand how this works." Alina didn't speak, didn't move, didn't break eye contact. And in that moment, for reasons he couldn't explain, Adrian Voss felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Uncertainty. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But somehow, this waitress wasn't reacting the way the world was supposed to react to him. And that made her dangerous. He just didn't know it yet. Because Alina Carter hadn't walked into his life by accident. And before this night was over, Adrian Voss was going to realize something that would begin to unravel everything he thought he controlled. Adrian Voss had spent his entire life mastering one simple principle. Control was not something you requested. It was something you took. And right now, sitting under the warm ambient lights of Vespera, staring at a waitress who refused to behave according to the rules of his world, he felt something that did not belong in his reality. Resistance. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was quiet. And somehow, that made it worse. Elena Carter stood in front of him, calm and composed, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't explaining. She wasn't trying to fix his perception of her. She was simply existing. Unaffected. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her the same way he studied acquisition targets before dismantling them. Every detail mattered. Her hands were steady. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes clear. No micro-expressions of fear. No submissive signals. No defensive tension. It was unnatural. Everyone reacted to him. Everyone. He had watched CEOs lose their confidence mid-sentence. He had seen seasoned negotiators stumble under his silence. He had watched powerful men try to earn his approval like children. But her, nothing. It irritated him more than he was willing to admit. He picked up the fork again, cutting into the food slowly, deliberately, buying himself time to observe her. She didn't look away. She didn't shift uncomfortably. She simply waited. Not for permission. Not for approval. Just waited. And suddenly, Adrian realized something else. She wasn't trying to please him. That was new. That was wrong. That was dangerous. Because people who didn't need his approval were unpredictable. And unpredictability was the only thing Adrian Voss couldn't control. He placed the fork down again. "You've been here long?" he asked. The question surprised both of them. He didn't ask personal questions. Not to waitresses. Not to anyone outside his world. Elena answered simply. "Long enough." Not a number. Not a timeline. Just ambiguity. It was intentional. Adrian noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to incomplete answers. He was used to compliance. He was used to clarity. He was used to obedience. This was something else entirely. He leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean?" Elena tilted her head just slightly. "It means," she said calmly, "I've seen a lot of people come and go." Her tone was neutral. But the words carried weight. It sounded less like an answer, and more like an observation. Adrian didn't like observations about himself. Not from strangers. Not from anyone. Especially not from someone he was supposed to be able to dismiss. He decided to end it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, removing several crisp $100 bills and placing them on the table beside the untouched plate. More than enough to cover the meal. More than enough to end the interaction. "I've lost my appetite," he said. The message was clear. This conversation was over. He expected her to take the money. To thank him. To disappear. But Elena didn't move. Her eyes shifted briefly to the cash. Then back to him. "You didn't come here for the food," she said quietly. The words hit him before he could stop them. Not because they were loud, but because they were accurate. And accuracy without data access was impossible. Adrian's expression hardened. That's an assumption, he replied coldly. Alina didn't flinch. Yes, she said. She didn't defend it. She didn't elaborate. She simply allowed it to exist. Which made it worse. Because now his brain needed to resolve it. How long have you worked here? He asked again, more firmly this time. She held his gaze. A while. Again. Ambiguity. Again. Intentional. He felt irritation building now. Not explosive. Focused. Precise. He wasn't losing control. But something was shifting. He could feel it. He had built his life on reading people faster than they could read him. But her, she wasn't projecting readable signals. She was contained, disciplined. And then she said something that changed everything. You don't like being watched, do you? Adrian froze. It lasted less than a second. But she saw it. He recovered instantly. His expression returned to neutral. That's another assumption, he said. She nodded slightly. Yes. Again, no defense. No apology. Just acknowledgement. It was infuriating. Because she wasn't trying to win. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply stating observations. And every observation was accurate. Which meant she was paying attention. Which meant she had been paying attention before tonight. And that thought introduced something new. Suspicion. He studied her face carefully now. Trying to find recognition. Trying to find evidence. Had they met before? No. He would have remembered. He remembered everything that mattered. But somehow, she felt familiar. Not visually. Psychologically. Like someone who understood patterns he didn't allow people to see. He didn't like that. He stood up. The movement was sudden enough to draw attention from nearby tables. I'm done here, he said. Alina stepped aside immediately, giving him space. But as he reached for his coat, she spoke again. One day, she said quietly, you're going to realize something. He stopped, not turning around. Not yet. Her voice hadn't changed. Still calm. Still steady. Still certain. You can control outcomes, she continued. But you can't control consequences. The words landed carefully. Precisely. Like they had been waiting. Adrian turned slowly. His eyes locked onto hers. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he wasn't certain what to say. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because he understood them too well. And he didn't know how she did. Be careful, he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Alina didn't react. Didn't retreat. Didn't challenge him. She simply said, I am. 2 words. No fear. No hesitation. Just truth. And that was the moment Adrian Voss experienced something that had not touched his mind in over 15 years. Doubt. Small. Precise. But real. He turned and walked away without another word. The restaurant slowly exhaled as the door closed behind him. The gravitational force had left the room. But Alina Carter remained exactly where she was. Still calm. Still steady. Still watching. Marcus rushed toward her immediately. "What the hell was that?" he whispered urgently. Alina picked up the untouched plate calmly. "Dinner," she said. Marcus stared at her like he didn't recognize her anymore. "You don't talk to him like that," he said. Alina didn't respond. She simply carried the plate back toward the kitchen. Because the interaction had gone exactly the way she expected. Exactly the way she needed. Outside, Adrian stepped into the cold Manhattan night. His driver opened the car door immediately. "Home, sir." Adrian paused. For the first time in years, he didn't have an immediate answer. He glanced back toward the restaurant, toward the windows, toward the place where she still existed. "Yes," he said, finally entering the car. The door closed softly. The car began moving. But Adrian wasn't thinking about his next meeting, or his next acquisition, or his next decision. He was thinking about her. Her composure. Her certainty. Her lack of fear. It didn't make sense. People didn't behave like that without leverage. And leverage required information. Which meant one thing. He needed to know who she was. Not casually. Not curiously. Precisely. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He opened a contact. Daniel Mercer, head of private intelligence at Voss Technologies. The man who found answers others couldn't. Adrian typed a message. Simple. Direct. Find everything on Alina Carter, Vespera Restaurant, immediately. He hit send. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian Voss wasn't responding to a threat. He was anticipating one. Because something deep in his instincts was telling him the truth his ego wasn't ready to accept yet. She wasn't random. She wasn't insignificant. And she wasn't afraid of him. Which meant she knew something. Something she shouldn't. Something no one should. And Adrian Voss had just made the first move in a game he didn't realize he had already begun losing. Back inside the restaurant, Alina stood alone for a moment. Her face calm. Her breathing steady. But her eyes carried something deeper. Something older. Something patient. She reached into her pocket and touched a small object hidden inside. She didn't remove it. She didn't need to. Just feeling it was enough. Because tonight had confirmed what she already knew. Adrian Voss hadn't changed. Not yet. But he would. Soon. Very soon. And when he did, he would finally understand why she had walked into his life. Adrian Voss did not believe in intuition. He believed in data. Data was clean, measurable, obedient. Intuition was emotional, unpredictable, weak. And Adrian Voss had not built an $11 billion empire on weakness. Yet as his car moved silently through the midnight streets of Manhattan, he found himself replaying the interaction again and again. Not the words, the control, or rather, her lack of submission to his control. It was a subtle distinction. But Adrian's mind specialized in subtle distinctions. Most people, when confronted with power, adjusted themselves unconsciously. Their posture shifted. Their tone softened. Their eyes avoided direct contact. It was biological. Survival instinct. Elena Carter had done none of those things. She hadn't challenged him, but she hadn't yielded either. She had remained perfectly centered, as if his power existed but didn't apply to her. That was the anomaly. And anomalies required investigation. His phone vibrated in his hand. Daniel Mercer. Efficient as always. Adrian opened the message. Basic preliminary file attached. More incoming. Adrian tapped the file. A photo appeared. Elena Carter. Employee ID photo. Neutral expression. Dark hair tied back. Brown eyes. Age, 27. Position, waitress. Employment duration, 8 months. Address, small apartment in Queens. No criminal record. No financial anomalies. No lawsuits. No media presence. No connections to competitors. No connections to him. Nothing. Adrian stared at the screen. It was too clean. People were never this clean. Everyone had patterns. Debt. Mistakes. History. But Elena Carter existed in the data like a ghost. Minimal footprint. Minimal trace. Minimal significance. And yet, she didn't behave like someone insignificant. Adrian typed back. Dig deeper. He didn't need to explain. Daniel Mercer never asked unnecessary questions. He only produced answers. Daniel Mercer had worked for Adrian for 6 years. Former intelligence analyst. Former military. Former everything. He understood one rule above all others. Adrian Voss did not request information. He required it. Daniel sat in his office, staring at Elena Carter's file. He had already accessed financial databases, employment history, education records, public records, everything aligned. Community college. Dropped out after 2 years. Series of low-income jobs. Nothing impressive. Nothing threatening. Nothing unusual. Except, he leaned closer to the screen. There was a 6-month gap. 8 years ago. No employment records. No education. No address verification. Nothing illegal. But nothing confirmed either. Just absence. Daniel frowned slightly. Absence was never random. Absence was constructed. He began digging deeper. Adrian arrived at his penthouse overlooking Central Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Minimalist design. Perfect symmetry. Perfect order. His assistant had left tomorrow's schedule on the glass table. Meetings. Calls. Decisions. Control. He ignored it. Instead, he walked to the window. The city stretched endlessly below him. Millions of lives. Millions of variables. All predictable. All manageable. Except one. He didn't like that. His phone remained in his hand. Waiting. He didn't know why. He told himself it was efficiency. Closing an open loop. But beneath that rationalization, something else existed. Something quieter. Something older. Discomfort. Across the city, Elena Carter sat alone in her small apartment. The room was simple. Clean. Organized. Intentional. Nothing excessive. Nothing accidental. She sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a folded photograph in her hands. The edges were worn. Handled many times. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it contained. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It stopped. Then buzzed again. She let it buzz. Then stop. Then buzz again. Finally, she picked it up. Not answering. Just looking. Watching. Waiting. Then she placed it back down. Untouched. Because she knew who it was. And she knew what he was doing. Adrian Voss had begun searching. Right on schedule. The next morning, Adrian arrived at his office at exactly 7:00 a.m. Not 7:01. Not 6:59. Control required precision. Daniel Mercer was already waiting. Tablet in hand. Expression neutral. I found something, Daniel said. Adrian gestured for him to continue. Daniel handed him the tablet. Elena Carter, Daniel said. Her records are real but incomplete. Adrian looked up. Incomplete how? Daniel tapped the screen. There's a 6-month period 8 years ago with no verifiable data. Adrian felt it. That subtle shift in certainty. Small. But real. Explain, Adrian said. No financial activity, no employment, no education records, no confirmed address. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. That's not possible. Daniel nodded. It is possible, he said, if someone wanted it that way. The implication settled into the room. Not random absence. Intentional absence. Adrian leaned back slightly. Why? Daniel hesitated. I don't know yet. Adrian handed the tablet back. Find out. Daniel nodded. He turned to leave. But Adrian spoke again. Daniel. Daniel stopped. Yes, sir. Adrian chose his next words carefully. Has she ever contacted Voss Technologies? Daniel blinked. It was an unusual question. No, he said. No record of that. Adrian nodded once. Daniel left the room. But the question lingered. Because Adrian wasn't asking about corporate contact. He was asking about something else. Something personal. Something irrational. Something he didn't like acknowledging. Connection. Later that afternoon, Alina arrived at work. Her routine unchanged. Her posture unchanged. Her calm unchanged. But Marcus noticed something different. Not in her behavior. In the environment around her. Two men sat at separate tables. Not eating. Watching. Subtle. Professional. Invisible to most. Not invisible to her. She saw them immediately. Private investigators. Adrian's investigators. She continued walking normally. No reaction. No acknowledgement. Because this was expected. Because this was necessary. Because this was part of the process. She tied her apron calmly. Prepared for her shift. Prepared for the next move. That evening, Adrian returned. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The restaurant felt him instantly. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't here to dominate. He was here to observe. And when Alina Carter walked into view, he felt it again. That subtle disruption in his internal order. She saw him immediately. Of course she did. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Adrian wasn't certain he was the one in control of what happened next. Because now he knew something. Her past wasn't clean. It wasn't random. It wasn't insignificant. It was hidden. And hidden things were never harmless. Alina approached his table calmly. Professional. Neutral. But her eyes carried something deeper. Something knowing. Good evening, she said. Same tone. Same composure. Same absence of fear. Adrian studied her carefully, trying to reconcile the data with the reality, trying to understand the contradiction. You've been here 8 months, he said. Not a question. A statement. Alina didn't react. Yes. He leaned forward slightly. And before that, a pause. Small. Precise. Then she answered. I lived somewhere else. Ambiguity again. Intentional. Controlled. Adrian felt the irritation returning. But beneath it, something else. Respect. Because she was playing the game correctly. Carefully. Intelligently. Which meant she understood the stakes. And that meant she understood him. Which raised the most dangerous question of all. Why? Why him? Why now? Why here? He looked into her eyes, searching for the answer. But she gave him nothing. Nothing except calm certainty. And that certainty told him something his ego didn't want to accept. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. And Adrian Voss was no longer investigating a waitress. He was confronting a mystery. One that had already begun dismantling the illusion of his control. Because the more he searched for answers, the more he realized something deeply unsettling. Elena Carter wasn't afraid of being discovered. She was waiting for it. Adrian Voss had built his empire on one fundamental truth. The past did not matter. Only results did. It didn't matter how you started. It didn't matter who you stepped over. It didn't matter what you left behind. The only thing that mattered was where you stood now. And Adrian stood at the top. Untouchable. Unchallenged. Unquestioned. Or at least he had been. Now, for the first time in 15 years, the past had begun to move beneath his feet like something alive. And it wore the face of a waitress who wasn't afraid of him. Elena Carter, Adrian said, watching her carefully. That's your real name. She didn't hesitate. Yes. The answer was clean. Simple. Unprovable in both directions. Adrian leaned back in his chair slightly. You've lived in Queens for 2 years, he continued. Another statement. Another test. Yes. Still calm. Still steady. Still nothing to grab onto. Adrian noticed something subtle then. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying to protect herself. She was allowing the questions. As if she had expected them. As if she had prepared for them. That realization sent a quiet signal through his nervous system. This wasn't reaction. This was anticipation. And anticipation meant intent. You're not surprised, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. She tilted her head slightly. About what? He held her gaze. About being investigated. A flicker. Small. Almost invisible. But Adrian saw it. Not fear. Recognition. Confirmation. And then she said something that made his pulse slow slightly. You investigate everything, she replied. Not defensive. Not accusatory. Just factual. Adrian's mind paused. Because she hadn't said people like you. She had said you. Personal. Specific. Certain. You speak as if you know me, Adrian said quietly. She met his eyes without hesitation. I know what you've done. The words settled into the space between them like gravity. Adrian felt it. Not emotionally. Structurally. A disruption in certainty. Because those words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Not admiration. Not judgment. Recognition. Which meant history. And Adrian Voss did not share history with waitresses. Or so he thought. Daniel Mercer didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns. And right now, Elena Carter did not fit her pattern. He sat in his office, surrounded by screens displaying fragments of her life. Every address, every job, every document, all real, all verified, but incomplete. He had gone back further now. 10 years, 15 years. And finally, he found it. A name. Not Elena Carter. A different name. Elena Hayes. Age, 12. Location, Newark, New Jersey. Daniel leaned forward slightly. This was new. He opened the file. Minimal records. Public school enrollment. Address linked to a woman named Rebecca Hayes. Single mother. Occupation, administrative assistant. Employer, Voss Technologies. Daniel froze. His eyes scanned the line again. Employer, Voss Technologies. 8 years ago. Daniel's heartbeat slowed. This wasn't coincidence. This was connection. He reached for his phone immediately. Adrian's phone vibrated on the table. He didn't look away from Alina when he answered. Yes. Daniel's voice was calm. Controlled. But Adrian knew him well enough to hear the difference. I found a connection, Daniel said. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly against the table. What connection? A pause. Then, her mother worked for you. The words didn't make sense at first. Adrian's brain processed them logically. Statistically. Impossible to avoid. He employed thousands. This meant nothing. And yet, it meant something. When? Adrian asked. 8 years ago, Daniel replied. Adrian felt something unfamiliar move through his chest. Not fear. Recognition. But he didn't know why. What happened to her mother? Adrian asked. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. She was terminated. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Why? Another pause. Internal restructuring. Corporate language. Sanitized. Meaningless. But Adrian knew what it meant. Cost reduction. Efficiency optimization. Necessary loss. Necessary sacrifice. Necessary consequence. He ended the call slowly. His eyes never leaving Alina. She had been watching him the entire time. Not curiously. Not nervously. Knowingly. You found her, Alina said quietly. It wasn't a question. Adrian didn't respond immediately. Because suddenly, he wasn't certain what game he was playing. Or who was winning. 8 years ago, Adrian Voss had made one of the most important decisions of his life. His company had been on the edge of collapse. Not publicly, not visibly, but internally, structurally, mathematically. It was failing. Costs too high. Margins too thin. Investors losing confidence. He had been 29. Young. Brilliant. Ruthless. And he had done what was necessary. He cut 312 employees in one day. No hesitation. No exception. No emotional interference. Efficiency demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice required indifference. He didn't know their names. He didn't need to. They were variables. Replaceable. Forgettable. Necessary loss. Necessary consequence. Necessary survival. He remembered walking through the office that day. The silence. The fear. The invisible hatred. He remembered not caring. Because caring was weakness. And weakness destroyed empires. He had saved the company. built it into what it was now, built himself into what he was now. Untouchable, unstoppable, unquestioned. Until now. Elena reached into her pocket slowly. Adrian's muscles tensed instinctively. Not fear. Preparation. She removed something small. A folded photograph. Worn. Handled many times. She placed it gently on the table between them. Adrian looked down at it. Didn't touch it. Didn't open it. He already knew. Somehow, he already knew. Go ahead, she said softly. Her voice was steady. But beneath it, something older lived. Adrian picked up the photograph slowly, unfolded it carefully. Inside was a picture of a woman and a young girl. The woman smiled warmly. The girl stood beside her, holding her hand. 12 years old. Dark hair. Calm eyes. Familiar eyes. Elena. Adrian felt something inside his chest shift. Not emotionally. Structurally. Reality adjusting. Reorganizing. The woman in the photo. Rebecca Hayes. He didn't remember her face, but he remembered her file. Termination, number 147. Administrative assistant. Cost, $62,000 annually. Savings, necessary. Consequence, irrelevant. Until now. She believed in you, Elena said quietly. Adrian looked up. Her eyes held his completely. She said you were brilliant. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't accuse. Didn't beg. She trusted you. Adrian didn't speak. Because something inside him had begun to fracture. Not guilt. Not yet. Something deeper. Recognition. She lost her job, Elena continued. Still calm. Still steady. Still controlled. And 3 months later. A pause. Small. Precise. She died. The words entered Adrian's mind without resistance. Without defense. Without protection. They simply existed. And for the first time in 15 years, Adrian Voss didn't know how to respond. Because for the first time in 15 years, a consequence had returned. Not as data. Not as numbers. Not as abstraction. But as a person, standing in front of him, looking directly into his eyes. Unafraid. Unbroken. Unfinished. And in that moment, Adrian realized something terrifying. Elena Carter hadn't come into his life by accident. She had come because of him. Because of a decision he didn't even remember making. Because of a consequence he never stayed to witness. Because of a past he believed was buried. But the past was never buried. It was patient. And now, it was here. Part 5 will reveal the twist that changes everything, and why Elena didn't come for revenge. Adrian Voss had spent his entire adult life believing in one unshakable principle. Consequences were theoretical. They existed on spreadsheets, in projections, In forecasts, they existed as numbers, not people. Numbers didn't stare back at you. Numbers didn't wait 8 years. Numbers didn't walk into your life wearing a black waitress uniform and speak to you with calm, unbreakable certainty. But Alina Carter did. And now she stood in front of him, watching him hold the photograph that represented a decision he didn't even remember making. Not because it wasn't important, but because to him, it hadn't been personal. He looked down at the image again. Rebecca Hayes. She was smiling, alive in a way that felt almost offensive now. Because Adrian knew something she didn't. He knew how her story ended. Or at least, he knew the part of it he had created. He folded the photograph carefully. His hands were steady. Years of discipline didn't disappear overnight. But something beneath that discipline had begun to shift. "You're her daughter," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Alina nodded once. Yes. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable. Not chaotic. Heavy. Measured. Adrian placed the photograph back on the table. He didn't push it toward her. He didn't pull it closer. He left it exactly where it was. Neutral territory. "I terminated over 300 employees that year," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, professional, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. Alina didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because that was the problem. To him, her mother had been one of 300. To her, her mother had been everything. Adrian continued. The company would have collapsed otherwise. Still factual. Still controlled. Still distant. Alina studied his face carefully. Looking for something. Not regret. Not guilt. Something else. Responsibility. "Do you remember her?" Alina asked. The question was simple, but it carried a weight Adrian couldn't calculate. He didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was dangerous. "No," he said finally. The truth existed between them. Cold. Clean. Unavoidable. Alina nodded slightly. As if she had expected that. As if she had prepared herself for it. As if she had already made peace with it. And that unsettled him more than anger would have. Because anger was predictable. Anger was controllable. Acceptance was not. He studied her face carefully. "You came here because of that," he said. Again, not a question. A conclusion. Logical. Structured. Expected. But Alina surprised him. "No," she said softly. The word landed heavier than anything else she had said. Adrian frowned slightly. It didn't make sense. "You found me," she continued, "because you were curious." Her eyes didn't leave his. "But I didn't come here for revenge." That was the moment everything changed. Because revenge would have made sense. Revenge was predictable. Revenge was human. Revenge was something Adrian understood. But this was something else. "Then why?" he asked. And for the first time since he had met her, Adrian Voss asked a question he genuinely didn't know the answer to. Alina didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because she understood the importance of timing. This was the moment everything shifted. Not for her. For him. She reached for the photograph again, her fingers brushing lightly across the worn edges. "My mother didn't blame you," she said. Adrian felt the words enter his mind like a foreign object. That didn't make sense. "She said you didn't know," Alina continued. Her voice was steady, controlled, but something deeper existed beneath it now. Something human. "She said you made a decision based on numbers." Adrian didn't speak, because she was right. He had. He always did. She said numbers don't see people. Alina looked at him carefully. But people still feel numbers. The sentence stayed with him. He couldn't dismiss it. He couldn't categorize it. He couldn't optimize it. It simply existed. And it disrupted him. "She never hated you," Alina said. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't want absolution. He didn't need forgiveness. Forgiveness implied wrongdoing. And Adrian Voss did not believe he had done anything wrong. He had done what was necessary. He had survived. He had succeeded. He had won. So why did this feel different? "Then why are you here?" he asked again. This time, his voice was quieter, less certain, less controlled. Alina studied him carefully, measuring him, not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, as a person. "Because I wanted to see you," she said. Adrian blinked. The answer didn't fit his models. "To see what?" he asked. Alina's eyes didn't leave his. "To see if you were human." The words landed without aggression, without accusation, without hatred. But they hit harder than any insult ever could. Because Adrian didn't know the answer. Not anymore. 8 years ago, Alina had watched her mother sit at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. Termination notice. Corporate language. Cold. Efficient. Final. Her mother hadn't cried. Not in front of her. She had simply folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, and smiled. "It's going to be okay," she had said, even though Alina could see the fear in her eyes, even though Alina could feel the uncertainty in the room, even though Alina understood, even at 12 years old, that something irreversible had happened. 3 months later, her mother collapsed in that same kitchen. Heart failure, the doctors said. Stress-related complications. Natural causes. But Alina knew the truth. Stress had a source. Consequences had origins. And origins had names. Adrian Voss. She hadn't hated him. Not the way people expected. Hate was emotional. Hate was chaotic. Hate was weak. Instead, she had wanted to understand him. Because understanding was power. And power was patient. Back in the present, Adrian sat in silence. He wasn't used to silence he couldn't control. He wasn't used to conversations he couldn't dominate. He wasn't used to outcomes he couldn't predict. But this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a transaction. This wasn't business. This was consequence. Human consequence. And human consequences didn't follow spreadsheets. They followed memory. They followed loss. They followed truth. You could have contacted me, Adrian said finally. Alina tilted her head slightly. Why? The question exposed the flaw in his logic. He didn't have an answer. Because he knew what he would have done. He would have offered money, compensation, resolution, closure. He would have converted consequence into currency. Because currency was controllable. Emotion was not. I wouldn't have listened, he admitted quietly. Alina nodded slightly. I know. She had never expected him to. That's why she had come here instead. That's why she had allowed him to find her. Because discovery was more powerful than accusation. Because realization was more powerful than revenge. Because change could not be forced. It had to be chosen. And Adrian Voss had just begun choosing. Even if he didn't realize it yet. For the first time in 15 years. Adrian didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel dominant. He didn't feel certain. He felt aware. Aware of something he had spent his entire life avoiding. The human cost of his success. Not as numbers. Not as variables. As reality. As consequence. As her. He looked at Alina again. Not as a waitress. Not as a threat. As a mirror. And what he saw in that mirror was not weakness. It was truth. And truth was the one thing Adrian Voss had never learned how to control. For most of his life, Adrian Voss had understood decisions as calculations. Inputs. Variables. Risk. Outcome. Every decision followed a structure. Every structure led to control. That was how he built his empire. That was how he protected himself from uncertainty. That was how he survived. But now, sitting across from Alina Carter, Adrian was facing something he could not calculate. Not because it was complicated. Because it was human. And human variables didn't follow predictable models. They followed memory. They followed loss. They followed truth. And truth had no algorithm. The restaurant around them continued moving, plates clinking, quiet conversations humming, glasses catching soft light, but Adrian barely registered any of it. His entire focus was on her. Not her appearance. Not her presence. Her certainty. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. She wasn't trying to gain anything from him. She had simply come into his world and existed. And that existence alone had begun dismantling something he didn't realize he depended on. The illusion that his actions ended when he stopped thinking about them. You planned this, Adrian said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was recognition. Alina didn't deny it. Yes. The honesty in her voice was almost disarming. "How long?" he asked. She considered the question carefully. "Long enough." Again, ambiguity. But this time, Adrian understood why. Because time, for her, hadn't been measured in days or months. It had been measured in understanding, in preparation, in patience, in waiting for the moment when he was ready to see her. Not as a waitress, not as a stranger. As a consequence, Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was thinking, processing, reconstructing reality around new data. "You got a job here," he said. "Yes." "You knew I came here." "Yes." "You waited for me to notice you." A pause. Then, "Yes." Each answer landed with precise clarity. No hesitation. No apology. No shame. Because she hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply positioned herself where truth could be seen. And Adrian had walked into it willingly. He exhaled slowly. A controlled release of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Why now?" he asked. Elena's eyes softened slightly. Not with sympathy. With understanding. "Because now," she said quietly, "you're finally listening." The words hit deeper than he expected. Because they were true. 8 years ago, he wouldn't have listened. 5 years ago, he wouldn't have cared. 3 years ago, he wouldn't have noticed. But now something had changed. Not in his power. Not in his wealth. In him. He didn't know when it started. He didn't know why. But he knew it was real. And that realization frightened him more than any competitor ever had. Because competitors could be defeated. Truth could not. That night, Adrian didn't go home immediately. Instead, he walked. Alone. No driver. No security. Just himself and the quiet rhythm of the city breathing around him. It had been years since he had walked without purpose. Without destination. Without efficiency. He moved past strangers who didn't recognize him. Didn't care about him. Didn't adjust themselves for him. And for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't Adrian Voss, the billionaire. He was just a man. A man confronting the consequences of decisions he had buried under success. He stopped at a crosswalk, watching people move past him. Each one carrying their own invisible history. Their own invisible losses. Their own invisible consequences. And he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. Every number he had ever optimized had belonged to someone. Someone with a face. Someone with a family. Someone with a future. Someone like her. He had never seen them. Because he had never needed to. Because seeing them would have made it harder. Because seeing them would have made it real. And reality complicated efficiency. But now he had seen one. And he couldn't unsee her. Back in her apartment, Elena sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She knew he was walking. Not because she could see him, because she understood him. This was the moment when certainty fractured, the moment when identity shifted, the moment when a man who had defined himself by control encountered something he could not control. Truth. She didn't know what he would do next. She didn't know what he would choose. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would choose something. Because he was no longer the man he had been when she first walked into his life. He had changed. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough to begin. The next morning, Adrian stood in his office, staring at the city through the massive glass windows. Daniel Mercer stood behind him, silent, waiting. Adrian hadn't spoken in nearly 5 minutes. Daniel had worked for him long enough to understand what that meant. His employer was confronting something that didn't have a clear solution. Finally, Adrian spoke. "How many employees do we have?" Daniel blinked, surprised by the question. 42,000 globally. Adrian nodded slowly. "And how many have we terminated in the past 10 years? Daniel hesitated. "I'd need to run exact numbers." "Estimate." Daniel thought carefully. Several thousand. Several thousand. The number existed easily in his mind. Clean. Abstract. Efficient. But now it didn't feel clean. Now it felt heavy. Because each number represented a story he had never stayed to witness. He turned to Daniel. "Do you ever think about them?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Think about who?" "The ones we let go." Daniel hesitated. "Not personally," he admitted. Adrian nodded. That had been his answer once, too. Not personally. Not emotionally. Not humanly. Just structurally. But now, structure had begun to fail him. Because structure didn't account for Alina Carter. Structure didn't account for consequence. Structure didn't account for truth. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Voss realized something that fundamentally changed him. He had spent his entire life optimizing outcomes, but he had never considered repairing consequences. And that was a different kind of decision. A decision without guarantee, without calculation, without control. A human decision. And human decisions required something Adrian Voss had spent his entire life avoiding. Vulnerability. He didn't know what he would do yet. He didn't know what the right action was. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would see her again. Not as a billionaire. Not as a man in control. As a man seeking understanding. And that alone represented the most dangerous transformation of all. Because the moment a man like Adrian Voss began to question himself, he stopped being predictable, even to himself. The silence inside the hospital room wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. Adrian Keller stood near the window, staring out at the sleeping city below, but he wasn't seeing the lights. He wasn't seeing the streets. He wasn't seeing anything except the past and the girl sitting behind him. Alina Reyes. The girl he had humiliated. The girl who had saved his life. The girl who now held the one truth that could destroy everything he had built. Behind him, Alina sat beside her mother's bed, gently adjusting the blanket. Her movements were calm, careful, controlled. But Adrian had spent his entire life reading people. And he could see it. She was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. 15 years of silence weighed on her shoulders. And now, finally, it was breaking. Adrian turned slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than she had ever heard it. "You said," he began carefully, "you didn't come here for revenge." Alina didn't look at him. "No," she said softly, "I didn't." He swallowed. Then why now? That was the question that mattered. Not why she hated him. Not why she confronted him. Why now? Alina finally looked up. Her eyes weren't angry. They were sad. "Because you were dying," she said simply. The words hit harder than any accusation. Adrian felt his chest tighten. "You were dying," she repeated, "and I realized something." She stood slowly. "I realized if you died, you would die believing a lie." Adrian's brow furrowed. "A lie?" Alina nodded. "That you didn't destroy anyone." Silence. Sharp. Unavoidable. Adrian's mind immediately went back to that night. The construction site. The accident. The settlement. The papers he signed without reading. The problem he paid to make disappear. He had told himself it was handled. Resolved. Finished. But standing here now, he realized something terrifying. He had never actually known the truth. "You think I wanted him to die?" Adrian asked quietly. Alina didn't hesitate. "No," she said. That answer surprised him. "I think," she continued, "you didn't want to know." That was worse. Because it was true. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He remembered being 26. Hungry. Desperate. Obsessed with winning. Every decision was survival. Every weakness was a threat. Every problem was something to eliminate. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't slowed down. He hadn't cared. Not enough. And now, 15 years later, the consequences were standing in front of him. Breathing. Speaking. Judging. Alina stepped closer. "I didn't come to punish you," she said. Her voice trembled slightly now. "I came to see if you were still the same man." Adrian met her eyes. "And am I?" She hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. She didn't know. Because he didn't know either. Before he could respond, there was a knock on the door. Both of them turned. Marcus Hale stepped inside. His expression was tense. Urgent. "Adrian," he said, "we have a problem." Adrian's instincts snapped back instantly. "What kind of problem?" Marcus glanced briefly at Alina, then back to Adrian. "The board." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Of course." "They know," Marcus continued. "They know what?" Marcus hesitated. They know you're reconsidering the redevelopment project. The room went cold. That project, the largest project in Keller Industries history. $1 billion demolition and rebuild, including the exact neighborhood where Alina grew up, where her father died, where dozens of families still lived. Adrian's voice hardened. How? Marcus exhaled slowly. Because someone leaked it. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Who? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Adrian understood. The board wasn't reacting. They were threatening. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. They're preparing a vote. Adrian felt his pulse rise. A vote for what? Marcus met his eyes directly. To remove you. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Alina watched Adrian carefully. For the first time since she met him, she saw something she never expected to see. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of losing power. Fear of losing control. They can't, Adrian said. But even as he said it, he knew they could. Because he had taught them how. He had built Keller Industries into a machine that prioritized profit above everything. Including him. Especially him. Marcus spoke carefully. They think you've become compromised. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. Compromised. Because he wanted to know the truth. Because he wanted to do the right thing. Because he was no longer the man they needed him to be. Alina stepped forward slightly. This is because of me. Adrian turned to her immediately. No, he said firmly. This is because of me. And for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't deflecting blame. He was accepting it. Marcus looked at Adrian carefully. The vote is in 48 hours. 2 days. 2 days to defend his position. 2 days to prove he still deserved to lead the empire he created. 2 days to decide what kind of man he was going to be. Marcus hesitated. There's something else. Adrian's patience was gone. What? Marcus swallowed. The board doesn't just want to remove you. A pause. They want to replace you. With who? Adrian asked coldly. Marcus's answer came like a knife. Me. Silence. Thick. Dangerous. Adrian studied Marcus carefully. His oldest ally. His closest friend. The man who had stood beside him for 20 years. You knew, Adrian asked quietly. Marcus didn't flinch. I suspected. Suspected, Adrian repeated. Marcus nodded. They approached me. Alina held her breath. Adrian stepped closer. And? Marcus met his gaze. I didn't answer. That mattered. More than Adrian expected. Why not? Adrian asked. Marcus's voice was steady. Because I didn't build Keller Industries. He paused. You did. Silence. Loyalty. Real loyalty. Not bought. Not forced. Chosen. Adrian nodded slowly. Thank you. Marcus gave a small nod. But the problem remained. The board. The vote. The future. And Alina. Because this wasn't just about Adrian anymore. It was about what he was going to do. Alina spoke quietly. You don't have to change anything because of me. Adrian looked at her. Yes, he said. I do. She frowned slightly. Why? Adrian answered honestly. Because for the first time in my life, I know what happens if I don't. He gestured toward her mother. Toward her. Toward the truth. Alina's voice was soft. You could lose everything. Adrian held her gaze. I already lost the only thing that mattered. She didn't understand. So he said it. Myself. The word hung between them. Raw. Real. Honest. And in that moment, Alina realized something she never thought possible. The man she hated was gone, and the man standing in front of her was someone new. But the world outside that room didn't care about redemption. It cared about power, and power was about to be tested. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked it. His expression darkened. They've scheduled it. Adrian's voice was calm. When? Marcus looked up. Tomorrow morning. Not 48 hours. Not 2 days. Less than 24. Adrian smiled slightly. Of course. They weren't giving him time. They were forcing him to react. To panic. To fail. But Adrian Keller didn't panic. Not anymore. Because for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to protect. Except the truth. He turned to Alina. Tomorrow, he said quietly, everything changes. She studied him carefully. She believed him. Not because he was powerful, but because he was no longer hiding. Adrian walked toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at her. There's one more thing you should know. Her heart tightened. What? Adrian's voice was calm. But I didn't just find your father's file. He paused. I found something else. Alina felt her pulse rise. What? Adrian held her gaze. A witness. The word hit like thunder. Alina's breath caught. A witness, she whispered. Adrian nodded. Someone who was there the night your father died. Everything froze. Everything changed. Because witnesses didn't exist. Not anymore. Not after 15 years. Not after silence. Not after money. Unless someone had been hiding, waiting, watching, and now they were ready to speak. Adrian's voice was steady. They're coming tomorrow. Alina's world tilted. Because tomorrow wasn't just the board vote. Tomorrow wasn't just about Adrian's empire. Tomorrow was about the truth. The real truth. About her father. About Adrian. About everything. And for the first time since she walked into that restaurant, Alina Reyes was afraid of what she might discover. Because sometimes, the truth didn't just destroy villains. Sometimes, It destroyed survivors too. And tomorrow, there would be nowhere left to hide. The morning air was sharp, crisp, and biting. Manhattan hadn't changed, but Adrian Keller felt like the city itself had turned against him. Every honking horn, every rushing pedestrian, every reflected window seemed to remind him of what was coming. He wasn't just facing a bored vote. He wasn't just facing betrayal. He was facing the accumulated weight of every choice he'd made and every consequence he'd ignored. Alina Reyes followed silently as Adrian strode into Keller Industries' glass tower. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak. She simply walked, feeling the tension coil in the air like electricity. 15 years of waiting, 15 years of silence had led to this day. The boardroom was pristine, sterile, and deliberately intimidating. 48 executives sat around a polished mahogany table, their expressions carefully neutral, or as close as anyone could manage when the fate of an empire hung in the balance. Marcus Hale, Adrian's oldest ally and the only person who could truly predict him, stood at the head of the table. His gaze was steady, neutral, but his presence was a warning. The board had already shifted, the players had moved, and now the final act had begun. Adrian entered, followed by Alina. Every eye turned. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. Whispers traveled like wildfire. This was Adrian Keller, billionaire, titan, untouchable. And yet there was a subtle uncertainty about him that hadn't been there before. He stopped at the head of the table, his posture perfect, but his mind alive with calculation. Alina stood behind him, a calm presence. Her eyes were sharp, focused, but there was no fear, only clarity. The chairman, Leonard Price, finally spoke. His tone was neutral, professional, but Adrian could smell the tension beneath it. "Mr. Keller," Leonard began, "we are here to discuss your position and the direction of Keller Industries. There have been concerns raised regarding recent decisions." Adrian didn't flinch. He had faced crises, hostile takeovers, and scandals before, but this was different. This was human. This was judgment. And he had no data model for judgment from the past meeting a living consequence. "I am aware of the concerns," Adrian said calmly, his voice slicing through the room, "and I intend to address them thoroughly." Leonard nodded. "Proceed." Adrian glanced briefly at Alina. Her presence steadied him. It reminded him of what mattered and what had been ignored. He began, not with justification, not with numbers, but with acknowledgement. 15 years ago, decisions were made in this room and in this company that affected lives outside of these walls, he said. His voice carried weight. Lives that I ignored because I believed I was optimizing for success. Efficiency, growth, survival. I now understand that survival without accountability is nothing. A murmur ran through the boardroom. Executives shifted uncomfortably. Adrian wasn't delivering a standard corporate defense. He was delivering truth. At that moment, Alina stepped forward and the room went silent. "I am Alina Reyes," she said, calm, unwavering. "I am here because one of those decisions changed my life forever. My father's life. My family's life. The truth that has been hidden from me, from him, and from everyone else is finally coming to light." Adrian felt a surge of protective instinct, not for his empire, but for her voice, for the clarity she had fought to maintain all these years. Leonard raised an eyebrow. Ms. Reyes. Alina held the room with her gaze. You don't need to hear about numbers, margins, or efficiency. You need to hear about consequence. She turned and pulled a folder from her bag, placing it on the table. It contained documents, photographs, and medical records, evidence Adrian had long assumed was lost or forgotten. The room tensed. Every board member leaned forward. Every executive realized the stakes were no longer abstract. Alina spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. This witness was present the night my father died. He saw what happened, and now, for the first time, the truth can be accounted for. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had prepared for confrontation, for betrayal, for numbers. He hadn't prepared for truth delivered with this precision, this calmness. The doors opened. A man stepped in, a witness, aged, nervous, but undeniably authentic. He had waited for this day for years, carefully documenting, carefully preparing, and now he spoke. My name is Thomas Green, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I was there when Mr. Keller's decision led to the accident. I saw everything. I can attest to the sequence of events, and I can testify to what was and wasn't intentional. Adrian didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply observed. Alina's eyes met his, and he saw something in them. A question, a challenge, a reflection of his own humanity. You can't fight this with lawyers or spreadsheets, she said softly. You can only face it. And Adrian did. He rose from his chair, walking slowly to the front of the room. He looked at every board member, every executive, every person who had ever trusted him to make decisions. I will not deny my role, he said, his voice steady. I will not hide behind power or position. I have lived my life believing that numbers justified actions. I have learned that numbers are not people, and people are not numbers. The room went quiet. Some executives shifted nervously. Others looked stunned. I made a mistake, Adrian continued. I failed to see the human consequences of my choices. I caused loss. I caused pain, and for that I take full responsibility. He turned to Alina. I cannot undo what happened to your father. I cannot bring him back, but I can ensure that truth, accountability, and change prevail from this point forward. Alina studied him carefully, then nodded. Slowly, approval, not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. Then Adrian addressed the board. I am willing to step aside if necessary. I am willing to make changes that ensure the integrity of Keller Industries. But I am also willing to fight to remain in my role because I intend to do it differently from now on. Humanely, responsibly, honestly. The witness, Thomas Green, stepped forward, presenting a full statement detailing what had happened 15 years ago. It was meticulous, precise, impossible to ignore. The board began to deliberate. Whispers circulated. Phones tapped into voting devices. Every second felt like an eternity. Adrian didn't move. He stood beside Alina, watching, waiting, aware that this moment defined not just the company, but himself. Finally, Leonard Price spoke. The board has reached a decision. Silence. The vote is unanimous, Leonard continued. Mr. Keller will remain CEO, but under conditions. Immediate restructuring of the board oversight. Establishment of a transparent accountability system, full acknowledgement of past mistakes, and cooperation with Ms. Reyes in documenting and correcting historical wrongs where possible. A wave of tension released. Relief, yes, but also a new responsibility heavier than any previous corporate crisis. Adrian exhaled slowly. He looked at Alina. "You came for truth," he said softly, "and you got it. Now help me ensure it matters." Alina smiled faintly. "That's why I'm here." Together, they stepped out of the boardroom. For Adrian, it was more than survival. It was transformation. For Alina, it was more than vindication. It was closure. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the reckoning that had just unfolded. But inside Adrian Keller, a change had taken root. Human consequences were no longer optional. Truth had been accounted for. And as they looked out over the skyline, side by side, both knew something unshakable. The past no longer controlled them. They controlled the future. Because sometimes it took a witness, a daughter, and the courage to face truth for a man to finally become human. And sometimes that was the only victory that truly mattered.